She was 21 and had just been kicked out. No family to call, no savings, just a canvas duffel and $10 she had earned cleaning stalls at a dairy farm outside Granite Falls. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned beekeeper's barn on the open prairie in western Minnesota, in a stretch of yellow Medicine County that had not seen a working hive since 1971. The clapboard had gone silver with prairie wind. The sliding door had rusted shut. But what nobody knew was that sealed inside the last hive box in that old barn was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Signe Dahl had grown up with the sound of bees, not the cartoon buzzing that people who have never kept bees imagine. The real sound. The deep, warm, collective hum of 40,000 honeybees working inside a hive box on a July afternoon. A sound that was not one sound, but 40,000 small sounds layered on top of each other until they became a single vibration you could feel in your chest if you stood close enough. Her grandmother had taught her to listen for that sound the way other grandmothers taught their grandchildren to listen for birds. Her grandmother's name was Liv Dahl, and she had been the last working beekeeper in yellow Medicine County. Liv had been born in 1932 on a small farmstead outside the town of Hanley Falls, 14 miles south of Granite Falls, the daughter of a Norwegian immigrant couple named Axel and Ragnhild Dahl, who had come to western Minnesota from a village near Trondheim in 1928 and who had homesteaded 80 acres of open prairie that was, in Axel's estimation, too flat for grain and too windy for dairy, but exactly right for bees. Axel had kept bees in Norway. He had understood that the open grassland of western Minnesota, the big bluestem and the prairie clover and the wild bergamot and the goldenrod that covered the county's unplowed sections from June through September, was the same kind of uninterrupted wildflower pasture that had sustained bees in Scandinavia for centuries. Axel had built the barn in 1930. A long, low, clapboard structure on a fieldstone foundation, with south-facing windows that let in winter sun and a wide sliding door that opened onto the prairie. The barn had been designed for bees. The south-facing windows warmed the interior in early spring, which let the hives build up faster than outdoor hives. The wide door let Axel roll the boxes out in May, when the wildflowers began, and roll them back inside in October, when the prairie went dormant. He kept 40 hives at his peak, 40 white wooden boxes on the grassland south of the barn, each one painted with a different colored symbol on the landing board so the bees could find their own hive. A blue circle, a red triangle, a yellow square, a green diamond. The symbols had been Axel's own system, invented from the understanding that a bee returning from a mile of open prairie needed a landmark it could read. Axel had also kept a small honey house in the back of the barn, a wooden workbench with a hand-crank extractor, a wax rendering pot, a set of tin straining screens, and a row of glass jars he had ordered every spring from a supply house in Minneapolis. He had sold the honey at the Granite Falls farm stand on Saturday mornings from 1931 until his death in 1959. 28 seasons of standing behind a folding table with a hand-lettered sign that said, Dahl Prairie Honey, Hanley Falls, Minnesota, and a row of golden jars catching the morning light. The women of the county had bought Axel's honey for the same reason they had bought it from his father in Norway, because the honey tasted like the place it came from, and because a jar of wildflower honey from a specific prairie was not the same thing as a jar of clover honey from a factory, and the women who bought it knew the difference. Axel had died in 1959. Liv had taken over at 27. She had kept the bees for 12 years, and those 12 years had been, in Liv's telling, the years in which the prairie had changed underneath her. When Liv had started in 1959, the wildflower pasture had still covered most of the unplowed sections of the county. Maybe 30% of the land in the road ditches and the fence rows and the creek bottoms and the quarter sections that the farmers had left in native grass because the soil was too thin or too wet to plow. 30% had been enough. The bees had flown the flower sequence from June through September, building their stores one species at a time, and they had come into winter, fat and full and ready. But the soybean boom had changed the arithmetic. Year by year, across Liv's 12 years, the unplowed sections had shrunk. A farmer would buy out a neighbor and plow the fence row between them. A drainage tile would be laid in a wet quarter section, drying it enough to plant. A road would be widened, and the wildflower ditches would be graded and seeded with fescue, which was tidy but which produced no nectar. Liv had watched the forage disappear the way a person watches a tide go out. Slowly enough that no single day looked different from the day before, but steadily enough that by the end the water was gone and the beach was bare. By 1969, Liv had drawn the pollination map. She had drawn it not as a record of what was, but as a blueprint of what would need to come back if anyone ever brought the bees back to this land. She had marked every remaining wildflower stand with colored ink, purple for prairie clover, blue for bergamot, yellow for goldenrod, orange for black-eyed Susan, and she had dated each stand and noted its acreage. By 1971, half the stands she had mapped in 1969 were plowed. The map was already a historical document before the ink was 2 years old. She had kept them for 12 years until 1971, when the last unplowed wildflower pastures in the county had been converted to soybean fields. Without the wildflower pasture, there was nothing for the bees to forage. Liv had sold 39 of her 40 hives to a commercial beekeeper in Wilmar named Gunderson, who planned to truck them to the almond orchards in California. Gunderson had backed his flatbed up to the barn on a cold October morning and had loaded the boxes one at a time, and Liv had watched them go and had not said a word until the truck had turned onto the county road and disappeared. And then she had said, to no one, in Norwegian, "Farvel, gentine mine." Goodbye, my girls. She had kept the 40th hive, the oldest box, the one Axel had built by hand in 1930, and she had left it in the barn, sealed shut with its own propolis, and had locked the door. Liv had married a man named Einar Dahl, a distant cousin from the same village near Trondheim. Einar had been a quiet farmer who understood that a wife who had lost her bees was a wife who was grieving, and that the correct response was not to discuss crop economics but to keep the barn standing and never mention selling it. He had kept the barn standing for 24 years until his death in 1995. Liv had kept it standing for another 16 after that, paying the taxes out of her Social Security. Liv and Einar had had one son, Per, who was Sina's father. Per had left Yellow Medicine County at 18, had worked construction in the Twin Cities, had married a woman named Deborah from Bloomington, had had Sina, and had divorced Deborah when Sina was 4. Per had been a man whose restlessness made him a good construction worker and a poor father. He moved to Fargo after the divorce, then Bismarck, then Billings. By the time Sina was 7, Pierre called once a month. By 10, he called on her birthday and Christmas. By 13, he did not call. Deborah had done her best, but Deborah's best had been limited: a dental assistant's salary, a 2-bedroom apartment in Bloomington, a series of boyfriends who were each variations on Per. Sina had spent most of her childhood shuttling between Deborah's apartment and Liv's farmstead in Hanley Falls, and the shuttling had taught her by the age of 8 that the world contained 2 kinds of places: places that changed every time you came back and places that stayed the same. Deborah's apartment was the first kind. The furniture moved. The boyfriend changed. Liv's farmstead was the second kind. The kitchen smelled like honey. The barn stood at the end of the gravel lane. Nothing at Liv's moved. Liv had taught Sina to work bees from the time Sina was 5. Not with the 40 hives, those were gone before Sina was born, but with the wild bees that lived in the hollow cottonwoods along the Yellow Medicine River, a quarter mile south of the barn. Liv took Sina to the cottonwoods on summer afternoons and taught her to stand near a wild colony without a veil and without gloves, because Liv had never worn a veil and believed that a beekeeper who needed mesh between herself and the bees had not yet learned to be calm enough for the work. "Stand still," Liv told her on the first visit when Sina was 5 and shaking. "They can hear your heartbeat. If your heart is fast, they think you are a bear. If your heart is slow, they think you are a tree. Be a tree, Sina." Sina had been a tree. She had stood bareheaded beside a hollow cottonwood full of wild bees on a July afternoon, and had slowed her breathing, and had felt her heartbeat drop, and the bees had landed on her arms and her shoulders, and had walked across her skin without stinging. She had been 5 years old. She had not understood at the time what she was learning. She understood now. Liv had taught her to read a frame of brood comb. Capped brood in concentric circles meant a healthy queen. Scattered capped brood, the pattern Liv called shotgun brood, meant a failing queen. Empty cells in the center meant the colony was preparing to swarm or was dying. Liv taught these patterns using old frames she had kept in the barn from the last season, and Sina had understood them the way she understood letters, as a language that, once learned, could not be unlearned. Liv had also taught Sina to taste honey, not the bland sweetness of supermarket honey, the specific flavors that came from specific flowers. Clover was mild, pale, buttery. Goldenrod was dark, strong, musky. Wild bergamot had a sharp herbal note, almost minty. And the rarest, honey from native prairie clover, Dahlia purpurea, was light amber with a faint smoky sweetness that tasted, Liv said, like the prairie before the plows came. The cottonwood visits were also the hours in which Liv talked about the prairie as it had been. She told Sina about the Blomster recephilia, the flower sequence, the succession of wildflowers from June through September that was the calendar the bees lived by. Prairie clover first, then wild bergamot, then black-eyed Susans, then goldenrod last. Each species handing the prairie to the next like runners passing a baton. The soybean fields had broken the sequence. Soybeans bloomed once, briefly, in July, and then they were done. "A prairie with only soybeans," Liv told Sina once when Sina was 11, "is a song with one note. The bees cannot live on one note. They need the whole song." Sina had memorized every flavor and every flower and every season. She had memorized them the way a devotion is memorized, not because someone assigned them, but because the saying of them was the keeping of them. Liv had also taught Sina to extract honey. On 3 Saturday mornings each August, Liv had brought the old frames out of the barn and had set them on the workbench in the kitchen, and had shown Sina how to uncap the cells with a heated knife. A slow, careful stroke across the wax surface, just deep enough to open the cells without cutting into the comb below. The honey had run from the uncapped cells in a single golden stream into the collection pot, and the kitchen had filled with the smell of warm wax and fresh honey and the specific clean sweetness of prairie clover nectar. Sina had been 7 the first time Liv let her hold the uncapping knife. Her hand had shaken. Liv had put her own hand over Sina's and had said, "Slow, like petting a cat. The wax will tell you when to stop." Sina had drawn the knife across the frame, and the wax had curled away in a thin golden ribbon, and the honey had run, and Liv had said, "Good, you have your grandfather's hand." Sina had carried that sentence. "You have your grandfather's hand," for 14 years. She had carried it the way other people carry a photograph or a ring. She had carried it through Deborah's apartment and Pierre's disappearance and the bus to Granite Falls and the stalls at Arneson's Dairy. It was the most important sentence anyone had ever said to her because it told her that her hands belonged to someone, and that the someone they belonged to had built 40 hive boxes and kept bees on the open prairie for 31 years, and had sold golden jars of honey at a farm stand every Saturday morning from 1931 until the morning he could not get out of bed. Liv had died when Sina was 16, a quiet death at home in Hanley Falls, on a Wednesday evening in October. The month the prairie went dormant, the month Liv had always sealed the hive boxes for winter. Per had come to the funeral from Billings. He stood at the graveside in a canvas jacket and said nothing, and left the same afternoon. He did not visit the barn. Liv had left the farmstead to Per. Per sold everything, 80 acres including the barn, to the neighboring soybean operation within 6 months, for $320,000. He gave Sina nothing. Sina did not ask. After Leave's death, Sina finished high school in Bloomington. Moved out of Deborah's apartment at 18, Deborah's newest boyfriend made it clear a grown daughter was not part of his arrangement, and took a bus to Granite Falls because it was the nearest town to Hanley Falls, and because she wanted to be near the prairie where Liv's bees had worked. The move to Granite Falls had been the first decision Sina had made entirely on her own. She had not discussed it with Deborah, who would not have understood. She had not discussed it with Pierre, who would not have answered. She had simply packed her duffel bag and Liv's smoker and a framed photograph of Axel standing beside the Hive boxes in 1955, a photograph Liv had kept on the kitchen shelf. And she had taken the Greyhound from Minneapolis to Granite Falls for $34, and had stood in the parking lot of the Granite Falls bus station on a cold September evening with her duffel bag at her feet and the flat prairie horizon stretching in every direction, and had thought, "This is right. This is the right place." She did not know yet what she would do here. She only knew that the land was correct. She lived in Granite Falls for 3 years. Small studio above a hardware store, $425 a month. Gas station, then grocery store, then a dairy farm outside town cleaning stalls and milking at 4:30 in the morning for a farmer named Arneson. Arneson was a quiet Norwegian-American in his late 50s who ran 60 head of Holstein on 300 acres of pasture and corn ground, and who did not say much, but who noticed, within Sina's first week, that she was unusually calm around animals. "You don't spook the cows," Arneson told her on her third morning, standing in the milking parlor with a cup of coffee and an expression of mild surprise. "Most new hires spook the cows. You don't? How come?" Sina said, "My grandmother kept bees." Arneson looked at her for a moment and then nodded and did not ask anything else, because Arneson was the kind of man who understood that a woman who had been calm enough for bees was going to be calm enough for anything. Sina had walked the county roads on her days off, the way she had walked them with Liv, looking for what was left of the old prairie. She found goldenrod in the road ditches. She found wild bergamot along a fence row south of Hanley Falls, a ragged strip about 20 yards long, the last stand of bergamot she would find in the county. She found prairie clover once, a single small patch growing in the gravel shoulder of a township road that had not been graded in years, the purple blossoms small and tough and vivid against the gray gravel. She had knelt beside it and touched it, and had thought of Liv's pollination map, which she had never seen but which Liv had described to her once, a map of the prairie as it was, drawn in colored ink, showing every wildflower field, every bloom date, every foraging route the bees had flown. In her second year in Granite Falls, Sina drove past the barn in Arneson's borrowed truck. The 80 acres were planted solid in soybeans. The farmhouse was gone, torn down by the soybean operation, but the barn was still standing. Silver clapboard, rusted sliding door, south-facing windows intact. She did not get out of the truck. She was not ready. But she noticed, the way Liv had taught her to notice, that the 2-acre parcel around the barn had not been plowed, and that the wild grass around the foundation was tall and untouched and full of goldenrod. The apartment ended in March of her 21st year. The landlord sold the building to a developer from Wilmar who tripled the rents. Sina could not afford the new rent on a dairy farmhand's wages. 30 days' notice. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever stood close enough to something alive to feel it hum? She had $680 in savings and no car. She had Live's old smoker, a small brass bee smoker that Axel had brought from Norway in 1928, and that Liv had used for 43 years, and that Sina had taken from the farmstead kitchen the weekend after the funeral, before Pierre sold everything. She found the listing on the Yellow Medicine County surplus property page at the Granite Falls Library. The soybean operation had petitioned the county to split off the barn and the 2-acre parcel because the barn was too small for equipment storage. Listed since 2015. Asking price, $10. She signed the deed the next morning. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Halverson, looked at the form and said, "Dahl, any relation to Liv Dahl?" Sina said, "She was my grandmother." Mrs. Halverson put the stamp down and looked at her. "Your grandmother sold me honey at the Granite Falls farm stand every Saturday for 15 years. I still have the last jar she ever sold me. I keep it on my kitchen shelf. I'm not going to open it." She stamped the deed and handed Sina an iron key on a loop of baling wire. "Welcome home, Miss Dahl." She walked the 3 miles to the barn that afternoon. It stood on the open prairie exactly as she remembered. She worked the rusted door free and slid it open. One large room. Post and beam frame, plank floor, south-facing windows. Along the north wall, stacked 3 high, the Hive boxes, 39 empties. And on the bottom shelf at the east end, set apart, Oxell's original box from 1930. Darker, heavier, older. The lid sealed with a thick ridge of dark amber propolis the bees had laid down themselves in the last season before the forage disappeared. Sina found a hive tool on the shelf. She worked the blade under the lid. The propolis cracked, a sharp, clean sound like breaking hard candy. She worked her way around, cracking the seal inch by inch. She lifted the lid. Inside, 10 frames. The outermost frames held crystallized honey, solid, pale gold, the sugar having crystallized across 5 decades. The center frames held old empty brood comb, dark and papery. Tucked between the last frame and the box wall, wrapped in waxed cotton, a rolled piece of heavy paper tied with string, and a folded letter. The paper was a hand-drawn pollination map of the prairie within 5 miles of the barn. Every wildflower field, every grass stand, every creek bed, labeled by species and bloom month. Dated 1969. Sign Liv Dahl. She opened the letter. "To whoever opens this hive. My name is Liv Dahl. I have kept bees on this prairie from 1959 until today, October 14th, 1971. The last wildflower pasture in this county was plowed for soybeans last spring. The bees sealed this box themselves when the forage disappeared. They stopped flying. They drew their cluster tight around the queen. They waited. They are gone now. But the honey they made in their last season is still in the frames. It is crystallized. It will keep forever. The map shows the prairie as it was, not as it is. Every field I have drawn is plowed now. The prairie clover is gone. The wild bergamot is gone. I do not know who will find this box. I hope it is a person who knows what propolis sounds like when it breaks. Find the flowers. Bring back the bees. Liv Dahl, Beekeeper, October 14th, 1971. Sina read it twice. She leaned her forehead against the side of the old hive box and closed her eyes and whispered, in the Norwegian. Liv had spoken to her beside the cottonwoods. "Tak, bestemor." "Thank you, grandmother." Then she was quiet for a long time. The crystallized honey was not money, but it was something she could sell. She scraped the comb from the outermost frames carefully, cut it into chunks, packed it into mason jars she bought at the hardware store for $12. 53-year-old raw comb honey from the last native wildflower forage in the county. She sold 18 jars at $15 each at the Granite Falls farm stand over 3 Saturdays, $270. She also kept her job at Arneson's Dairy 3 mornings a week. Between the honey and the dairy, she had enough to eat and buy what she needed. The first month was the barn. 39 empty hive boxes, untouched for 53 years, all needed to come down, get scraped of old wax and propolis, and checked for rot. Sina worked through them one at a time with Oxell's hive tool and a wire brush and a bucket of hot water she heated on a propane camp stove she had set up in the barn doorway. The work was slow and physical. Each box weighed about 30 pounds, and the propolis on some of them had hardened to the consistency of amber and had to be chiseled off in thin, brittle flakes. She worked 6 hours a day. She ate lunch sitting on the foundation wall, looking out at the prairie, the same prairie Axel had looked at from the same wall in 1930. 12 of the 39 boxes were sound. The white pine Axel had used was dense and tight-jointed, and the boxes on the upper shelves had been protected from ground moisture. She ordered replacement frames and foundation wax from a bee supply in Marshall for $340. A woman at the supply house, a beekeeper named Greta Lindquist, asked Sina what she was setting up. Sina told her. Greta said, "I knew your grandmother. She sold the best wildflower honey in the county. Nobody's matched it since." Greta gave her a 10% discount and her phone number and told Sina to call if she needed anything. By late May, she had 12 clean hive boxes set out on the prairie south of the barn, each facing southeast, each landing board painted with one of Axel's symbols: blue circle, red triangle, yellow square, green diamond. The boxes were empty. She needed bees. She found them in June. A wild swarm on a fence post a quarter-mile south of the barn. 10,000 bees clustered in a hanging mass the size of a football, humming in the warm afternoon sun. A neighboring farmer named Dale Thorson had called Arneson about it, and Arneson had called Sina. "There's a swarm on Thorson's fence line," Arneson said. "Thorson wants it gone. I told him you'd come get it." Sina walked to the swarm with Axel's smoker and a cardboard box, and no veil. She stood beside the cluster for a full minute, breathing slowly, feeling her heartbeat drop, the way Liv had taught her at the cottonwoods. Then she puffed 2 small clouds of smoke beneath the cluster, held the box under the mass, and shook the post once. The bees fell in. She carried them to the first hive and poured them in. They went. Within an hour they were flying, exploring the prairie in widening circles, finding the wildflower strips she had planted along Thorson's fence row, returning to the landing board with the blue circle, and walking inside. Thorson, watching from his truck 50 yards away, said to Arneson later, "She didn't even wear gloves. Who does that?" Arneson said, "Her grandmother." He bought Sina a cup of coffee from his thermos and drove her back to the barn without saying anything else. She got a job in her 2nd year. The Yellow Medicine County Soil and Water Conservation District hired her as a part-time pollinator habitat coordinator, a position created partly because the district had learned that a young woman in Hanley Falls had re-established honeybee hives on open prairie for the first time in 50 years, and had begun, using Liv's map, to plant native wildflower strips along the fence rows and road ditches. Prairie clover, wild bergamot, goldenrod. The flowers Liv had mapped in 1969, returning to the margins of the soybean fields. Arneson came to the barn one Saturday in July to buy honey from Sina's first harvest. He tasted it on a spoon in the barn doorway and stood still for a moment and said, "That's what my grandmother's honey tasted like. I haven't tasted that since I was a boy." He bought 6 jars. He told his neighbors. By September, Sina had a waiting list. Greta Lindquist from the bee supply drove down from Marshall one afternoon with a box of old bee journals she had been keeping since the 1980s and said, "These belonged to a beekeeper in Redwood Falls who died in 2003. He would have wanted them in a working barn." A retired soil scientist from the University of Minnesota Extension Office in Granite Falls, a man named Arnie Tollefson, heard about the wildflower strips and drove out to the barn to see them and told Sina that the native prairie clover she had planted along Thorson's fence row was the first Dahlia purpurea he had seen growing in Yellow Medicine County in over 30 years. He asked if he could bring a soil sample kit next time. Sina said yes. Sina called Pear in November. She did not know why she called. She told him about the barn and the bees and the sealed hive box and Liv's letter. Per was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I shouldn't have sold it." Sina said nothing. There was nothing to say that the bees were not already saying. On a clear evening in late August of her 24th year, Sina sat on the fieldstone foundation wall and watched the last copper light fade across the open prairie. 12 hive boxes in their row on the grassland, the bees settling in, the last foragers returning in long, curving flights from the wildflower strips along the fence rows. Goldenrod blooming gold in the road ditches. The sound of 12 working hives carried across the evening air. Not the sound of 40 hives, not the sound Axel had heard in the 1930s or Liv had heard in the 1960s, but a beginning. A hum a person could feel in her chest if she stood close enough. She thought about Liv, who had stood in this doorway on an October morning in 1971 and had watched Gunderson's flatbed carry 39 hives away to California and had said goodbye to her girls in Norwegian. She thought about Axel, who had painted blue circles and red triangles on wooden landing boards because he understood that a bee needed a landmark to find its way home. And she thought about Per, who had sold the farmstead and given her nothing, and who had said on the phone in November, "I shouldn't have sold it," which was the first true thing he had said to her in years. That's the thing about the sounds our grandmothers teach us to hear. We do not always know, when we are 5 years old and standing bareheaded beside a hollow cottonwood, that the hum is the lesson. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, across a childhood measured in cottonwood visits and honey tastings. And then, 5 years after the old woman dies, we find a sealed box on a shelf, and we crack the propolis, and we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us to listen for the sound a sealed thing makes when it opens. The crack of propolis is not a breaking, it is a beginning, Sina Dahl was 21 years old and kicked out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned beekeeper's barn on the open prairie in the western Minnesota grasslands. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.